Well, yeah, it's still couples talk because you and I are a couple.
Okay.
I mean, unless you don't want to be anymore.
Oh my gosh. Hello and welcome to Couples Talk. I'm Jonathan Decker, co-founder of Mended Light and licensed therapist.
I'm Alicia Decker, CEO of Mended Light.
Joining us today is Lark Galley, entrepreneur and author of Learning to Breathe Again, Choosing to Heal After Losing a Loved One to Suicide. Lark, thank you for joining us today. She has a very powerful story about mental health and loss to suicide and grief, and she's going to share her journey with us in this series of videos. So, hello.
Hello, thank you.
So, where are you from originally?
Born in Utah, lived all over the United States, went to a different school every year of my life, not by choice.
Military or?
No, father was undiagnosed bipolar, and so every day was an adventure. Looking back, I didn't realize how very odd that was. And it was difficult for different members of my family. Me, not so much. For my sister, another sister, was very hard for her to make friends, to adjust. It was not good for her, and stability-wise. But my father, being bipolar, some things were a little bit harder, and other times when he was on his mental high, it was a huge adventure.
Yeah, when he was manic, it was amazing.
Oh, it was amazing. I can remember when I was in 7th grade, we lived outside Nashville, Tennessee. He came home and he pulled out the maps. He got us all together in the living room and he pulled out the maps and he said, "Kids, this is where we live now, and tomorrow we're driving to Virginia and we're gonna live in Virginia. Yay!" And all the kids went, "Yay!" And we packed up that day, which, we didn't have a lot of stuff. All my stuff fit in an orange box, filled the U-Haul with whatever furniture we had, and off we went.
So did he have to keep changing jobs, or did his career allow for it? He would just...
So he had a master's degree, and he worked for himself sometimes, and then he had at certain times he had very good paying jobs, but he always had this unfulfilled need to find something else, to always be
Something
moving,
more,
changing
something
more. Yes,
different.
and he did lots of different things, lots of different things, just in an attempt to quiet the demons, I want to say.
Yeah. And because he believed he could. I mean, during manic episodes, as you well know, he believed he could do anything.
Yes.
And that sheer, let's do it, let's make it happen, that sheer, that fearlessness and that, and what were the swings like? Would he have a few weeks on, a few weeks off, or what?
Yes, but as a child, I didn't always understand that. It was mostly about the excitement. But a lot of times when we moved to Virginia, he went to work on a dam project that they were doing. So he left us in a small town.
Sounds like a frustrating project.
Yes, and it was. And he went to stay.
Sorry, I'm a dad, I got it.
But he went to stay at the man camp. And so it was a couple hours away, and we only had one vehicle. And so he gladly left my mom home with the 7 kids. I was 11 at the time. I was the oldest. 7 kids, all very close in age.
So you had to pick up a lot of the slack.
Yeah, me and my sister were, the 2 oldest. And he would hitchhike to this place, and then he'd come home on the weekends. And I think it kind of fulfilled that adventurous spirit of doing something manly, off and not having to deal with the day-to-day issues. So that was one example. A lot of times he was just not there emotionally, even if he was there physically.
Yeah, because there's the dark side to bipolar, which is the depressed episodes. Did that come out, if I can ask, did that come out as anger, irritability, detachment? Sadness?
I would say detachment, so a lot of emotional detachment. All of us kids sort of grew up with emotional detachments, and I can very quickly turn off any kind of emotional connection to anyone, including family members, spouse, kids, and I've had to learn that that's not always a good way to have relationships.
But you would turn it off with your father because it would be hard, it would be sad. So you got 5%.
Well, it was a coping mechanism, right?
Yeah.
It's like,
if I don't
it's
feel
not
loved,
safe to be attached because at any point there could be detachment and you don't understand what's going on. You're a child. Like, you don't even know that this isn't normal.
Right.
But you got 5% of your dad or 200% of your dad, right?
Right.
So we're talking mental illness. Was that something that popped up in your family more than just with him?
Well, and he wasn't even diagnosed with that until he was in his 50s, so we really don't know what's going on. And at the time, it wasn't a thing. But looking back now, obviously, hindsight, you can see all the things that were going on.
Yeah.
His mother had depression and pretty much the same thing, but she was never diagnosed in her life. And so she would have, the highs and the lows. And I can remember staying at her house after a family gathering. I was there still, everybody had gone home, and she was talking to her daughter, my aunt. And I overheard her, and she was saying, I just feel so sad and so depressed, and I don't know why. And all the kids, the grandkids, they had just left just a little bit earlier, and she'd been on such a high then, and now the house was pretty much empty, and she was on a low.
Yeah.
And that's what I remember from her, and I can remember from my father, when my parents finally got divorced, because they were back and forth, and that was another part of the problem.
Yeah.
He would do really strange things. For example, when I was probably 10, he said to my mom one night, I think I'm going to take 3 of the 7 kids, and these 3 they seem to need more emotional help. I'm just going to take them and disappear, and you'll never see us again.
Wow.
And this was in the early 70s, so you can imagine it was a probability. You can't really track people back then.
Yeah.
But that was his idea, just like it came to him that's what he needed to do. And my mom, of course, freaked out. And within a couple weeks, she packed us up and left him and didn't tell him. Left him.
How old were you?
I was 11 at that time.
So you packed up, you left. Did they ever reconcile?
Yes, they reconciled, another 6 months later. And so we went, when we had moved to Southern California to be with my mom's parents. And then they came back to Tennessee.
We take so much for granted now as far as mental health understanding, mental health treatment, technology, the ability to find somebody,
And that it's not taboo, and we can actually talk about it, that going to a mental therapist or a therapist is just as like getting a checkup from a doctor. Like, it's something that you do because your mental health is just as important as your physical health.
I want to ask you a bit more about, you talk about the ability to shut down connection with anybody. Yeah. That was a coping mechanism, as Alicia said, for growing up, and that carried into adulthood. How has that affected your family relationships and your other relationships?
So right now, with my 6 siblings, we have varying degrees of connection. It's not a lot. We hardly ever see each other. There's one sister that I have not talked to in 7 years. So since my father passed away almost 8 years ago, within that same year, we had a falling out. She basically threatened me and said, if you don't do X, Y, Z, I'm never going to talk to you again. And I thought, well, that actually is not a bad thing. Yeah. And my life has been better for not having her in it to, cause emotional turmoil. So I think at some point that it's okay to close people from your life if they're going to cause drama and trauma in your life. It's actually a healthy thing. The other thing that I realized, and not too long ago, is that the way I tried to deal with relationships with my husband was how I saw it pattern in my parents, which was, they would be together, things would be fine, and then they would have a disruption, and how each of them coped with marital struggles was they would leave. So my parents, for 8 years, between the time I was 8 to 16, they were apart and together until they finally got divorced. And at 8, I can remember thinking, my parents aren't going to make it. And yet they tried because, we're trying to stay together for the kids, right? Yeah. But in retrospect, for the kids, it really would have been better if they had terminated it, because it was just a back and forth. And the kids all knew at some point, this is not going well. This is not going to end well.
So there were so many layers of insecurity and instability, right? Like there was the physical aspect of where are we going to live? Maybe we'll live somewhere else tomorrow. And then the emotional instability of your dad's mental health struggles. But then, of course, how that played out into the marriage, right? And so there's so many layers of how that affected you.
Exactly. And so I realize now that a lot of times how I've been coping with my marriage is, it got to the point where, we're having troubles, so now I need to leave. I need to flee, in a sense, to be safe. Yeah. When in reality, my husband is like, that's not a big deal, or why are you making a bigger deal of this than it is? But it was patterned for me.
Divorce, people don't want to divorce because they think it's going to be hard on the kids. And the research shows that while divorce is hard on kids, they're pretty resilient. compared to a couple staying together in constant turmoil, it's oftentimes better.
Well, and it's not so much the question of should we get divorced or should we not get divorced, but the number one thing that affects the children is the level of conflict.
Right.
Right. And so there was a lot of conflict, which caused a lot of instability. But if the conflict was minimized, it would have also minimized the instability.
Right. You know, the thing about it was that they didn't like have shouting matches in front of us. It wasn't so much that. It was they would go behind closed doors and have discussions. But we could always feel things. And my mom wasn't always open. She would say, okay, kids, you know, we need to do this, but don't tell your dad. So we always felt like dad was on the outside.
Yeah.
Understandably, because if he was in a stable place mentally and emotionally, then he could be a stable part of the family. But if he wasn't in a stable place, I'm sure your mom had to feel like in those moments of like, I'm going to take 3 of the kids and disappear. She's like, I need to protect my children.
Exactly.
Right?
Right.
Well, and there's so many resources now compared to then for mental health treatment, for family and relationship counseling, to get support to work through these things. Like the research is there, the tools are there, the skills are there, the resources are there. We just have to reach out and grab them.
Right.
You know, to that end, for those of you watching at home, we've created an assessment tool. What is your mental fitness, your mental health fitness? There's a link for that in the description, and you can go and take that and see where are my strengths and what am I struggling with, and maybe what support should I be seeking.
Well, so I have 2 questions for you, Lark. One, like looking back, because I know in hindsight, it's like so many things are clear and so many pieces of the puzzle, you know, have come together. As an adult, what was the number one way this most affected your life? Like that you didn't realize, right? And then what is one thing that you wished you could tell your younger self?
Oh.
What is that?
So I would say younger self, hang in there. It will be okay. Maybe step back and evaluate a situation and don't react all the time. Allow people grace in where they are and don't take on their instability. That's maybe what I would say. Something that I learned that was very interesting is that years before my father died, because of the emotional disconnection from all of his children, I was having a conversation with several of my siblings, and we pretty much said, you know, when dad dies, we're not going to go to a funeral, we're not going to cry. He's emotionally dead to us now, so what would it even matter physically when he actually passes away?
And at this point, when you had that conversation, were you aware of the bipolar diagnosis and all of those things?
Yes, we were aware of it at that point. So he would have been in his 50s. It probably was about 10 to 15 years before he died. And so we were sort of aware, but it was so
Angry.
fresh. Yeah, we were angry.
You were hurt,
He
understandably.
was talking about suicide all the time. I knew at some point he was going to end his own life, take his own life, because of the way he talked about it all the time. He obsessed about it. And, you know, I didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, Dad, that you're freaking us out, but, you know, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to tell you. I'm still a child in a sense.
Well, and that's what I tell people is they often turn to their family members or their loved ones for help or for support. And the fact is, family members and loved ones aren't trained professionals for this sort of thing. The analogy I use is if I'm walking across the street and a car hits me and knocks my leg off, it's great that my family's there to hold my hand and say, we're really sorry this is happening to you, we're here for you, but I need a surgeon, you know, I need a paramedic, I need someone to stop the bleeding, I need someone to reattach the leg, and I can't count on my family to do that. And it's the same thing with mental health. I mean, no child is equipped to handle that.
No.
Right?
Even an adult child, right?
And especially when you're dealing with family who's so close to the situation and has so much emotion and you know, distortion in the way they see it.
Well, and each of you experienced your own trauma and dealt with it in subsequent ways, right? And have been for decades.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm sure as an adult, you're like, I have my own children. Like, I cannot continue with this emotional
Pattern.
whiplash
Yeah.
and this instability. Like, this is exhausting, and it's been exhausting my whole life. And I'm not responsible.
So that is what happened. Then he took his own life.
So then he did take his own life, and then what was interesting from that is that he didn't want a funeral, but my one sister really wanted to do something. And so his desires was to be cremated. Fine, we cremated him, and it was about a month after he died is when all of us could get together. And so my sister arranged like a a memorial service where it was very small, just close family, a couple friends, not many, and several of the kids talked. And what was interesting is that I spoke and I cried, and I was the only child that actually cried. I'm not very emotional, and that was another thing is learned from my dad is like, you don't show emotion, hardly ever cry, touch. I didn't want, before my son died, it was don't touch me. Like I didn't want to be touched by anyone, including my children.
Yeah.
So that you can imagine how many walls were there. But I had a lot of emotion, and for 5 months after my father died, I went into a black hole.
Yeah.
And I never in a million years thought that I would react that way. And so you don't know how you're going to react when a loved one dies.
Or what's within you. We want to thank Lark. This has been part 1 of our series. In our next episode, we're going to touch on suicide further because your father is not the only time this has affected your life. We'd like to invite you to watch this video, Trauma and Sexual Abuse Part 1, where we discuss healing and hope on your trauma journey. And we're going to see Lark in our next episode. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, keep shining because we need your light. Please like, comment, subscribe, and click the bell.